When the first reports of the Soviet T-34 reached German command in 1941, the tank crews laughed. They called it crude, a box of steel hammered together by peasants. Its armor was sloped, its tracks wide, its engine noisy. To the Germans, who worshipped precision, it looked like an insult to engineering. Nothing that ugly could fight, one Panzer officer said. Then came the snow. On the frozen plains outside Moscow, the laughter stopped. German tanks, sleek, over-tuned machines, froze in place as their engines choked on ice. Their treads slipped across the frost like glass, and out of the white silence came the sound of something new, deep, steady, unstoppable. The T-34 seconds appeared like ghosts covered in frost, exhaust trailing like breath in the cold. Their guns turned slowly, deliberately. When they fired, the snow itself seemed to shatter. German shells bounced off their angled armor. Machine guns rattled uselessly. And the men who had mocked the T-34 realized, too late, that this peasant's tank wasn't just a machine, it was the winter itself, forged in steel. In the summer of 1941, when the German army launched Operation Barbarossa, they believed the war in the East would be over before winter. Their Panzers, sleek, precise, German-engineered perfection, rolled across Poland and into the Soviet Union with mechanical confidence. The roads turned to dust under their treads, and their crews sang songs about victory that seemed inevitable. Every encounter reinforced the myth. The Soviet armor they met early on the BT series. The light T-26 was outdated, underarmed, and poorly manned. German 37mm shells sliced through them like paper. Commanders joked that Russian tanks were built for surrender. Then, one morning near Minsk, something new appeared. A tank unlike anything the Germans had seen before. Its armor glowed dull grey under soot and dust, its turret wide, its cannon thick and steady. It moved differently, slower, heavier, confident. The Panzer crews opened fire. Their shells struck, sparked, and slid away. The T-34 didn't stop. It turned, fired once, and the German lead tank vanished in a blast of flame. At first, the Germans called it luck. Then, more reports came in. Tanks that refused to die, armor that deflected everything smaller than an 88mm gun, tracks that could cross rivers of mud where no Panzer dared. The T-34 was no accident. It was evolution. While German designers had built their tanks like watches, elegant, intricate, precise, the Soviets had built theirs like hammers. Every bolt, every weld, every curve had a purpose. To survive the land it fought on. Its wide treads were made for Russian soil, soft, uneven, alive. Its sloped armor turned shots away instead of absorbing them. Its diesel engine didn't ignite easily, and its simplicity meant it could be repaired by a farmer with a wrench. It wasn't beautiful, but it was immortal. German engineers studied captured T-34 seconds in disbelief. The armor was thicker than expected, but lighter because of its angle. The tracks were wider than any Panzer, a design perfect for snow and mud. And its gun, the 76.2mm, could destroy any tank in the Wehrmacht's arsenal at normal combat range. General Guderian himself admitted, "Our Panzers are no longer the best in the world." It was the first time those words had ever been spoken in the German army. Still, the generals believed they had time. The Soviet factories were far behind the front lines. They assumed the Red Army could never build enough of these monsters to matter. But in the east, deep beyond the Urals, the Soviets were already working in shifts day and night, in unheated plants building the storm that would soon roll west. When the first snow fell, the Germans discovered their own perfection was a trap. Their machines were too delicate, their engines too sensitive. Oil froze in their lines. Steel cracked under the cold. Tanks that had ruled the summer now sat helpless in the frost. And out of that blizzard, across a white horizon, came the silhouettes of the T-34, dozens at first, then hundreds. Their engines growled, their tracks crushed snow like bones, and their crews wrapped in sheepskin and smoke didn't speak. They didn't need to, because for them, winter wasn't an obstacle, it was home. By November 1941, the snow began to fall light at first, then endless. The German advance toward Moscow slowed, then stalled. The ground froze solid. Engines coughed and died in the cold. Lubricants turned to sludge. Steel, the pride of German engineering, began to snap. For months, the Panzers had ruled the plains. They had swept through villages, forests, rivers, unstoppable. But now, every mile was a struggle. Men froze in their trenches, radios cracked from frost, and the tanks, the heart of the Blitzkrieg, became iron coffins half buried in snow. Inside one of them, Lieutenant Karl Richter sat shivering, watching frost creep across the glass of his gun sight. His Panzer III hadn't moved in 2 days. The crew had run the engine every hour to keep it from freezing, but the fuel was running out. Outside, the temperature dropped to -30. They had been told the Soviets were finished, that the Red Army was retreating in chaos. But as the blizzard howled across the steppe, something moved in the white. At first, it looked like shadows, vague, slow shapes crawling through the fog. Then came the sound, low, heavy, rhythmic. The ground trembled. Richter grabbed his binoculars, squinting through the snow. What he saw made his blood run colder than the air. They weren't trucks. They weren't horses. They were tanks. Dozens of them. Broad, sloped, coated in ice like creatures born from the storm. Their engines growled through the blizzard, diesel smoke rising like breath. The Soviets had returned. "Range 800 meters," his gunner shouted. "Target front." Richter gave the order. The Panzer fired the recoil, shook the hull. The shell streaked across the white and hit. The Soviet tank flinched, sparks flying from its side. Then it kept moving. "Reload! Fire again!" The second round hit the turret. Same result, nothing. The T-34 rolled closer, its turret turning slowly, deliberately. Richter's crew watched in disbelief as the enemy's gun aligned with surgical calm. When it fired, the world exploded in orange light. The Panzer's armor split open like paper. The crew was thrown against the walls. Richter crawled out through smoke and fire, half deaf, half frozen. Behind him, the tank that had carried him across half of Europe was now a burning carcass in the snow. Through the smoke, he saw the T-34 up close for the first time. It wasn't elegant. It was brutal, sloped like a predator's skull, its metal scarred but unbroken. The Soviet commander stood in the turret, his face hidden behind frost, and stared at the wreckage. Then the tank moved on. Around Richter, the same scene repeated, one Panzer after another, collapsing under the weight of the Soviet counterattack. The German line disintegrated. Orders vanished in the wind. What had once been an unstoppable army now looked like men lost in a storm. For the first time since the war began, German tank crews were afraid of what they couldn't see and what they couldn't stop. Over the next days, the temperature fell even lower. Entire companies froze to death inside their vehicles. Ammunition cracked in half. Oil solidified. But the T-34 seconds kept moving. Their engines didn't stall. Their tracks didn't slip. They rolled across rivers, fields, and frozen roads like they were part of the terrain itself. "It is as if they were born from the snow," one German survivor wrote later. In every direction, Soviet armor emerged from the white ambushing convoys, cutting supply lines, surrounding entire divisions. The German command couldn't believe the reports. How could the Red Army, battered and retreating only weeks ago, now field so many tanks? The answer lay hundreds of miles east in factories buried deep beyond the Urals. There, under snow and smoke, the Soviets had rebuilt. They had dismantled their industry, moved it east by train, and reassembled it in secret. The result was unstoppable, an army of steel and winter. By December, even the Luftwaffe couldn't help. Planes froze on their runways. The front was collapsing. For the first time, the myth of the invincible Panzer was cracking like the ice beneath its treads. And everywhere the Germans looked, the same grey shape haunted the horizon, the T-34, its barrel steaming, its armor shining through the frost. To the men inside their burning machines, it didn't look like a tank anymore. It looked like the cold made flesh. By mid-December 1941, winter had consumed the front. The snow no longer fell in flakes, it fell in walls. Visibility dropped to meters, engines froze overnight, rifle bolts jammed, and still the Soviets kept coming. The German soldiers began to whisper a new phrase, "Der Schnee kämpft für Russland." The snow fights for Russia. They weren't wrong. The Wehrmacht's columns stretched for hundreds of miles, thin lines of machines and men designed for speed, not survival. The supply routes from Poland had collapsed under frost. Food ran out, fuel ran out. But the Soviets? They had the T-34. It wasn't just a tank. It was an ecosystem. It could fight, move, and live in the same conditions that killed everything else. The secret was simplicity. Its wide tracks glided over snowdrifts that swallowed German vehicles whole. Its diesel engine ignited even in -40 degrees, while the gasoline engines of the Panzer III and IV sputtered and died. Its crew wore fur coats and felt boots, while the Germans still fought in thin field uniforms designed for summer in France. On December 5th, the Soviets struck back. Hundreds of T-34 seconds, supported by KV heavy tanks and fresh infantry, smashed into the frozen German line outside Moscow. The offensive began in silence, no artillery barrage, no warning, just the low growl of engines rising through the blizzard. German scouts reported movement in the snow. Commanders dismissed it as a storm. Then the shells started falling. The Soviet tanks didn't come from one direction, they came from everywhere. Across frozen rivers, through forests, down roads buried under ice. Entire battalions of Panzers were surrounded before they could react. Inside one of the lead units, Sergeant Otto Weber clutched the periscope of his Panzer IV and saw them. Grey shapes moving through the storm, their silhouettes flashing between snow gusts. "There!" he shouted. "Fire!" The gunner aimed and fired. The shells screamed into the white, then vanished. No explosion, no hit, just the echo. Weber turned to look again. The shapes were closer now. He counted 10, 15, 20. "My God," he muttered, "they're everywhere." The first T-34 burst through the haze like a charging beast, snow flying from its treads. Its gun fired point blank, the German tank exploded in a shower of steel and flame. Another followed, then another. The Panzers fired back, but their shells ricocheted off the T-34's sloped armor, leaving glowing scars. From above, the battlefield looked like a nightmare painted in grey and orange burning wrecks half buried in snow, columns of smoke twisting upward into a blizzard sky. German tank crews tried to retreat, but the snow turned to traps. Their treads spun helplessly as the Soviets closed in. In one desperate engagement near Klin, a German company of Panzer IIIs fought for 4 hours against a formation of 30 T-34 seconds. When the smoke cleared, only 2 German tanks were still moving. The rest were frozen graves. The survivors who escaped described it as fighting ghosts. They came from the snow and vanished back into it, one said. By late December, the myth of German armor superiority was dead. The Wehrmacht's elite panzer divisions, the same men who had conquered half of Europe, were in full retreat. German generals blamed the weather. They said no army could fight in those conditions. But the truth was simpler. The Soviets could, because their machines were born in them. The T-34 didn't just survive the winter, it used it. The cold hardened its steel. The snow muffled its approach. The wind carried its engine noise away. It was as if the machine itself was forged from the land it defended. A German colonel wrote in his final field report, "Our tanks have become statues. Theirs have become storms." That winter, more German tanks were lost to cold than to combat, but to the men inside them, it didn't matter. Cold or fire, it was the same end, an enemy they couldn't match. As the Soviets pushed the Germans back from the gates of Moscow, the once proud Panzer Corps, the symbol of Blitzkrieg, now crawled backward through snow, hunted by the very tanks they had once mocked. For the first time since the war began, the invaders were no longer advancing. They were running. And above the frozen silence of the Russian front, one sound echoed across the plains, the deep, rhythmic growl of T-34 engines rolling through the snow. The laughter was gone now. All that remained was the cold. By January 1942, the German front was no longer a line, it was a fracture. The once disciplined divisions that had rolled through Europe were now scattered across a frozen wasteland. Maps were meaningless. Compasses froze solid. Command posts were buried in snowdrifts. Radios, their batteries dead from the cold, hissed, only static. The Blitzkrieg, the great storm of movement and speed, had stopped breathing. For the men inside the Panzers, life had become a routine of survival. Wake, scrape the frost from the optics, try to start the engine, fail, and pray the next Soviet patrol didn't find them first. Fuel was so scarce that tank crews drained their own radiators for water. At night, they lit small fires inside the hull to stay alive. Sometimes the smoke killed them before the cold did. And always, somewhere beyond the white horizon, came that sound, the deep, uneven growl of T-34 engines. At first, the Germans called it superstition. You hear what you fear, they said. But soon, the sound became real. Soviet armor began to appear at random, not in mass formations, but in small, deadly packs. 3, 4, 5 tanks moving like hunters through the snow, hitting and vanishing before the Germans could react. In one frozen village outside Kaluga, a German tank platoon tried to make a stand. They lined their Panzers along the main street, barrels pointed toward the forest. The sky was white, the snow waist-deep, and visibility less than 50 meters. The men waited in silence. Then the ground began to tremble. One by one, the T-34 seconds emerged from the tree-line grey, silent, their turrets already turning. The Germans opened fire, but their shells bounced off harmlessly. The return fire was instant. The first Panzer exploded, its turret blown clean off. The second caught fire from a single hit to the engine block. The rest tried to reverse, but their treads spun uselessly in the ice. From the forest's edge, the Soviet tanks advanced without pause. The snow clung to their hulls like armor, their exhausts spewing black clouds that twisted through the blizzard. They looked alive, one German crewman remembered, like beasts crawling out of the earth. Within minutes, the street was a graveyard of steel. The Soviets didn't stop. They rolled over the wreckage and vanished into the storm. When the snow settled, nothing moved except the flames, tiny orange flickers against an ocean of white. Elsewhere, the same story played out across hundreds of miles. The T-34 became a phantom that haunted every road, every forest, every frozen field. German soldiers carved its silhouette into the frost on their tank hulls, a crude warning to each other. They are here. In Berlin, generals debated solutions. Orders were sent for new designs, the Panther, the Tiger machines that could outmatch the T-34, but those would take time. On the front, time didn't exist. Only cold and survival did. By February, the Soviets had pushed the Germans back more than 100 miles from Moscow. Thousands of men were dead, frozen, or missing. What had begun as a march of conquest had become a retreat through hell. For Lieutenant Karl Richter, who had survived the destruction of his Panzer weeks earlier, the retreat felt endless. He walked for days through waist-deep snow, his face cracked by frostbite, his hands raw from cold. Every few miles, he saw the same sight, German tanks half buried in snow, their barrels pointing uselessly toward the sky, their crews frozen inside. Statues of defeat. He reached an abandoned farmhouse where Soviet shells had torn the roof away. Inside, painted on a burned wall, someone had scrawled in charcoal, "Steel dies faster than men." Richter stared at the words for a long time before walking on. Behind him, in the distance, the T-34 seconds kept moving relentless, steady, alive. They didn't need roads. They didn't need supply lines. They simply existed, part of the land itself. As the winter dragged on, even Soviet soldiers began to speak of the tanks as living things. They gave them names: Bely Volk, the White Wolf, Mat Stali, Mother of Steel. They believed the snow protected them, that the cold itself fought for them. Maybe it did. When spring finally came, the snow melted and the truth emerged. The fields were littered with metal, Panzers cracked open like shells, half buried in mud, their insignia barely visible. And scattered among them, untouched, were the T-34 seconds. Some had broken treads, others empty fuel tanks, but their armor still shone under the thawing sun. To the Soviets, they were symbols of survival. To the Germans, they were warnings. The war in the East was far from over, but one thing was clear: the age of German dominance had ended in the snow. Their precision had frozen. Soviet simplicity had prevailed. From that winter onward, the T-34 was no longer a tank. It was a legend, the machine that turned the Eastern Front white with fear. And for the German tank crews who survived, the memory of that sound, the deep, growling hum rolling through endless snow, would follow them forever. By 1943, the snow had melted, but the scars of that first winter never did. Germany's engineers had learned the hard way that precision meant nothing without endurance. Factories worked day and night to build the Panther and the Tiger tanks heavier, faster, deadlier, designed for one purpose only: to kill the T-34. But while the Germans were designing perfection, the Soviets were building infinity. Deep beyond the Urals, assembly lines roared without pause. Every hour, another T-34 rolled out crude welds, simple parts, paint still wet. It didn't matter. They worked, they moved, they fought. By the time the Battle of Kursk began, the Red Army had over 20,000 of them. The Germans brought their finest machines, the Tigers with their massive 88mm guns, the Panthers with their flawless optics, and met an ocean of steel. When dawn broke over Kursk on the 5th of July 1943, the horizon shimmered with heat. To the Germans, it looked like salvation: dry ground, clear skies, no snow. Finally, they would fight on their terms. But then the earth began to shake. The sound was different now, not the growl of a few engines, but the roar of thousands. T-34 seconds rolled over the ridges in waves green, grey, black with soot. Their turrets turned in unison. It was not an army, it was a tide. The first shells screamed across the plains. The air filled with smoke, dust, and the smell of burning oil. German shells tore through Soviet tanks by the dozen, but for every one that burned, 2 more appeared. The Tigers punched holes through the ranks, yet still the line advanced. It was no longer a battle, it was an avalanche. Inside his Tiger I, Captain Hans Rieder shouted coordinates over the roar of the engine. "Target, 11 o'clock, fire!" The 88mm gun cracked, and a T-34 vanished in a burst of flame. "Hit!" the gunner yelled, but before the cheer faded, another Soviet tank rammed into view, its gun already aimed. The return shot tore through the Tiger's side armor. Rieder's world went white. Flames filled the cabin. He crawled out through the top hatch and fell into the dirt, ears ringing, face blackened. Around him, the battlefield was chaos, hundreds of tanks burning, black smoke twisting into the sky like pillars. He looked up and saw the same machine that had haunted the Wehrmacht since that first winter, the T-34. Its armor pitted, its paint scorched, but still moving forward. He realized then what the Soviets had known all along. War didn't reward perfection. It rewarded persistence. Across the front, the story repeated. German tanks outperformed the T-34 inches one-on-one combat, but they were too few. Their gears jammed, their engines overheated, their tracks broke under mud and debris. The T-34 seconds, crude as they were, just kept coming. At one point during the battle, a Soviet commander radioed to his division, "Do not count the losses, count the distance to Berlin." By the time the sun set, Kursk was a furnace. The fields burned for miles. The air shimmered with heat and dust. Thousands of tanks lay silent German precision buried under Soviet endurance. The T-34 had survived again. It had proven, once more, that the land itself fought through it. When the battle ended, the Wehrmacht had lost its last chance to regain the initiative in the east. The road to Berlin was now open, and the machine that had once been mocked as peasant steel led the way. From that moment on, the Germans no longer laughed at the T-34. They studied it, copied it, feared it. Some even respected it. A German officer captured near Kiev later said, "The T-34 is not a tank. It is Russia. You can kill one, but not all of them." The snow would return that winter, just as it always did. But this time, it no longer belonged to Germany. When the frost hardened on the fields and the white wind blew across the wrecks of Kursk, the world knew who the true master of the Eastern Front was. Because the T-34 wasn't built to win battles, it was built to outlast them. And as its engines rumbled westward, toward Poland, toward Germany, toward history, the legend of the winter machine, the tank that was born from snow, rolled on, unstoppable. When the smoke cleared over Kursk, the world had changed. The T-34 was no longer a secret. It was a legend. From that summer onward, its shadow rolled westward across every front, through the forests of Belarus, across the plains of Poland, and finally into the heart of Germany itself. By 1945, the same tank that had once looked crude and awkward now thundered through the ruins of Berlin. German soldiers who survived from 1941 watched it pass and whispered, "The snow has followed us here." They weren't wrong, because the T-34 wasn't just a weapon anymore, it was an idea. It had defeated not only the Wehrmacht's tanks, but its philosophy, that war could be won through perfection. The T-34 proved that survival was the highest form of intelligence. It could be built fast, fixed anywhere, and driven by men who had never seen a factory. In the chaos of the Eastern Front, that was genius. After the war, everyone copied it. Engineers from Britain, America, even Germany studied captured models and shook their heads in disbelief. It shouldn't work this well, one said. But it does. Its design, wide tracks, sloped armor, simplicity over sophistication became the blueprint for every tank that followed. The Panther and the Tiger had been masterpieces of art. The T-34 was a masterpiece of survival. In the years that followed, it didn't retire. It multiplied. Factories from Prague to Pyongyang built their own versions. Soviet instructors trained new crews on every continent. By the 1952nd, the T-34 was everywhere, from the deserts of Egypt to the jungles of Vietnam, from the Korean mountains to the African savanna. It outlived empires. It outlasted its creators. Even when it stood rusting in forgotten depots, its shape still carried power. That sloped armor, that low silhouette, that defiant simplicity, it became a signature of the 20th century itself. For Germany, the memory of it never faded. The veterans who had once mocked the peasant tank remembered the way its shells screamed through the snow, the way it crawled through mud when their own machines froze. To them, the sound of its engine was the sound of defeat. For Russia, it became pride. Monuments rose in cities and villages, T-34 seconds mounted on pedestals, their barrels pointing toward the horizon. Children climbed on them, veterans saluted them. Every May, they were covered in flowers. They weren't just memorials, they were ghosts that never left. In Moscow's victory parade of 1945, rows of T-34 seconds rolled through Red Square, their treads clattering against the cobblestones. Stalin watched from the Kremlin wall and smiled faintly. The machine that had saved his nation now announced its triumph to the world. And even as the Cold War began, the T-34 remained a bridge between eras, a relic that still worked, still fought, still terrified. It had been born in desperation, raised in frost, and crowned in fire. No other machine had seen so much of history. Decades later, when the last of them were retired from service, many were left standing in the same fields they had once fought in. Some were covered in snow again, their tracks half buried, their paint faded to grey. But even in silence, they looked alive, as if waiting for the engine to start once more. A Soviet engineer once said, "We did not build the perfect tank. We built the tank that would always arrive." That was the secret. Not beauty, not speed. Arrival. The T-34 didn't win because it was flawless. It won because it was inevitable. And for every German tanker who once laughed at its shape, the memory of that laughter still echoes, buried somewhere under ice and rust, beneath the steel remains of 1,000 burned-out Panzers. The winter may have ended, but its sound never did. If you stand on the frozen plains of Russia today, when the wind is right, you can almost hear it, the low, distant rumble of engines rolling through snow, because the T-34 never stopped moving. It just drove into history,